Let's talk about a place you probably think you know, Concord, Massachusetts, a place famous for revolution and legendary writers. But before all of that, it had a different name, Musketaquid, and its story? Well, it's not just about colonists. It's about the powerful, inevitable collision of two worlds, thousands of years in the making.
You see, the name the indigenous people gave this land was Musketaquid. In their Algonquian language, that means grassy river. And for literally millennia, this place was defined by its three rivers, the Sudbury, the Assabet, and the Concord. They were the lifeblood, providing everything, fish, game, and that incredibly rich soil for their crops.
And that really sets up the big question for our story, doesn't it? You have one world, thousands of years old, completely intertwined with this land. And then another world, driven by a powerful faith and huge ambition, shows up from across a massive ocean. So what actually happens when they finally meet, right here on these riverbanks?
All right, so let's start with the world that was already here. And we need to be clear, this was a complex, established society. It was led by some really powerful people who were already navigating a time of incredible, world-altering change, even before the first English ships appeared on the horizon.
Now get this, the most powerful leader in the entire region was a woman. But here's the thing, we only know her by her title, Sonksqua, which means woman leader. The English colonists who wrote everything down never bothered to record her actual name. But her authority, her power over the Massachusetts Confederacy, was absolutely undeniable. So imagine her world for a second. It was just one crisis after another. After her husband, the great Sachem, was killed in 1619, she had to take charge. And she wasn't just dealing with wars between tribes, but also these horrific epidemics brought by Europeans that were just wiping out coastal communities. She was a brilliant diplomat, using her children's marriages to build alliances, and her own marriage to the spiritual leader Webcalat in 1635, that was a political masterstroke, combining both political and spiritual power at the exact moment the English were arriving. But you know, history isn't just about the big-name leaders. It's also about the ordinary people who have to live through these huge changes. And at this very same time, there was a 13-year-old girl named Tazun, a local chief's daughter. Picture her, watching from the shore, seeing these strange, giant wooden boats and all the new metal tools they brought, but also hearing the terrifying whispers about the disease and death that always seemed to follow these newcomers.
And this is where the personal story really becomes the heart of this massive historical shift. Tazun ends up marrying a man named Wakeben, who wasn't just a spiritual teacher. He was also the stepson of the great Songenskwa. Their marriage was a huge deal, uniting two really powerful families right as the English were knocking on the door. And this young couple, they were about to be thrust right into the middle of it all, becoming the crucial cultural and linguistic bridges between their people and these strangers.
Okay, so now let's pivot. Let's talk about the leader of that other world arriving on these shores. And he wasn't just some farmer looking for a better life. Oh no, this was a man of noble birth, incredible wealth, and a vision so powerful he believed it was a divine mission. A mission that was going to reshape Musketaquid forever.
So who was this guy, Reverend Peter Bulkey? Well, he was absolutely not your average settler. This guy was English elite, born into the gentry, a Cambridge-educated intellectual, a respected clergyman, but his super strict Puritan beliefs put him on a direct collision course with the Church of England. In 1634, he gets suspended for refusing to conform. For a man of his stature, that was a huge deal. So what does he do? Something radical. He sells everything, cashes in his assets, packs up his family, and sails for New England.
And this quote, man, this really gets to the very core of his whole vision. It's from his book, The Gospel Covenant, which was actually one of the very first books ever published in America. For Bulkley, this wasn't just about running away from persecution. He was on a divine mission. He wanted to build a perfect society, a beacon of Puritan holiness that would shine out from the American wilderness, a place governed by biblical law, totally free from the corruption he saw back in the English church.
You know, there's this romantic legend that Bulkley arrived with this small, brave band of about 12 families. The reality? Totally different. Town records show that in just the first 6 years, there were over 70 different family surnames listed. This wasn't some tiny pilgrimage. This was a major, large-scale settlement operation, all financed and led by Bulkley himself.
All right, so this is it. This is the moment. These two worlds finally come face to face. The English decided to name their new town Concord to signal peace. But as we're about to see, the very agreement that founded this town of peace was built on a massive, fundamental cultural misunderstanding.
And you can see the misunderstanding baked right into this deal. The English offered practical stuff: metal tools, cloth, some wampum beads. From their point of view, this was a straightforward real estate transaction. They were buying, permanently, 6 square miles of land. But for the indigenous leaders, the whole concept of one person owning the land was completely alien. They almost certainly thought they were just giving these newcomers the right to use the land, to join their community as neighbors, not to take it over for good.
And this fundamental misunderstanding got put to the test almost right away. When the settlers built a dam for Reverend Bulkley's new grist mill, a critical piece of their English-style economy, it completely destroyed a traditional and vital indigenous fishing weir. This was a direct threat to the local food supply and could have easily blown up into violence. Instead, in a move that was honestly pretty rare for the time, Bulkley and the other leaders actually acknowledged the harm they'd caused and offered a second round of gifts to make up for it. It was the very first test for the town named Concord, and both sides thankfully chose to talk it out instead of fighting.
This whole incident just throws these two totally different worldviews into sharp relief, right? On one hand, you have Bulkley. His power was seen as individual, granted by God. The local tribes even called him the man of the big prey. His authority was tied to his personal status and his ownership of the land. Then you have the indigenous leaders. For them, power was about collective stewardship of the land for the good of the whole community. Theirs was a socially inclusive worldview that welcomed the English not as invaders, but as new neighbors to be brought into their society.
So, where does all this lead? What's the long-term fallout from this meeting of worlds? Well, the legacies of these founding figures didn't just stop with them. They flowed down through the generations, creating two deeply intertwined yet dramatically different paths for their descendants.
Sassoon and Wabin's son, Wigramamanet, his story just perfectly captures the impossible futurists people were facing. His life was stretched between two cultures. He even attended Harvard, right alongside the sons of the English elite. But then, decades later, when the brutal King Philip's War broke out, he faced an impossible choice. He took the English name Captain Thomas Wabon and served as a scout for the colonial militia. It was a painful, heartbreaking act of survival, but it probably saved his immediate family from being killed or sold into slavery, while other indigenous people were being hunted down.
Meanwhile, the Bulkley family's legacy is heading down this completely different path. Generations later, Peter's direct descendant turns out to be a guy named Ralph Waldo Emerson. He also went to Harvard, but he would go on to spark a philosophical revolution of his own. You can draw a direct line from the Puritan founder's intense, fierce quest for spiritual purity to his famous descendants' call for intellectual self-reliance. It's that evolution that ultimately cements Concord's identity as the intellectual soul of America. And what's so wild is that you can still see the footprints of these families in Concord today. The historic Wright Tavern, a crucial site in the American Revolution, it was built on land originally owned by Peter Bulkley. His body is thought to be in a mysterious, unmarked tomb nearby, and the only reason they think it's him is because of this unique, square glass viewing hole built into the coffin lid. And Tassin? She lived a long life and eventually became a Squanxwa herself. Her family line continued, and in a striking symbol of how much the world had changed, her great-grandson left to become a whaler, joining the new maritime economy that had completely replaced his ancestors' world. So, in the end, the English founders called their town Concord, hoping for a peaceful start. But the real story of Musketaquid is so much more complicated than that one hopeful word. It shows how one world's vision for a holy city required the land and the resources of another, and ultimately just swallowed it whole. It really forces us to ask, for the descendants of both the Puritan visionary and the indigenous leaders, what was the real cost of that peace? And looking back all these centuries later, what was truly gained and what was lost forever?